few times. Not all of you. I think you're going to go with that one, okay? Easy when I've got lots of papers. Well, I'm proud to call myself a feminist. So I think had I been born at the turn of the century, I'd like to think that by the time I turned 18, I'd have been one of those proud women that donned a green and purple sash and campaigned for votes for women. Because it's as important to me today as it was to the suffragettes back then that we all have a vote to choose who we put in power over us, and a vote, of course, to get rid of those same people if they don't act in our country's best interests or do a bad job. And this is really at the heart of why I want to vote to leave the European Union, because it's slowly, very slowly, salami slicing away, I think, everything that the suffragettes fought for. Our elected members of Parliament, the ones we vote for at the ballot box, can't do anything about EU law. They're completely hamstrung, because EU law, by law, takes precedence over UK law. And we don't have the right, we can't vote for the EU lawmakers. So in this way, the unelected, the unaccountable, the undemocratic, and I'd argue subsequently the unafraid bureaucrats trample on the sacrifices of those who fought to get women the vote by taking those votes away from us by stealth, by depriving them of their power. So the EU isn't only undermining democracy, it's not advancing the cause of women's rights really either. And we've heard people say that women's rights will be in jeopardy if we leave the EU. But I think people who say that need to look at history, they need to look at the facts, because I think they couldn't be more wrong. The UK's always been streets ahead of the EU when it comes to women's rights. The first Equal Pay Act in Britain, pioneered by our first female Minister of State, the Labour Member of Parliament, Barbara Castle, was signed in 1970, 3 years before we joined the EU. By the time we joined, our governments had already passed the Abortion Act, the Divorce Reform Act, and the contraceptive pill was free on the NHS. Soon after we joined, we passed the Sex Discrimination Act, the Employment Protection Act, the Domestic Violence Act, and Britain elected the Conservative Member of Parliament, Margaret Thatcher, as Britain's first female Prime Minister. All of that without any help or input from the EU. And look at a serious issue like female genital mutilation. We made it illegal in 1985, and yes, I'm the first to say that not enough is being done to stop it. But the EU only caught up with a serious issue like that, making it illegal across the EU in 2012, much, much later. As for maternity rights, and I'm going to choose this as an example of the many issues that I could have done on rights, I think when the Remain campaign tells you that maternity rights are in peril if we leave the EU, I think they're getting a bit desperate. As members of the European Union, Britain has extended paid maternity leave, equal pay, and anti-discrimination measures to millions of working women in Britain. Screen one piece from the Remain that I saw recently. Really? Well, factually, yes, it's true that maternity rights have improved while we have been members of the European Union. But this is wordplay. Those improvements have nothing whatsoever to do with our EU membership. They've been entirely independent of it, and certainly not driven by Europe, as Kate said. The relevant EU directive on maternity rights was introduced in 1992, and it says that employers across the EU must give pregnant women 14 weeks uninterrupted maternity leave at a rate at least equivalent to sick pay. But here in the UK, pressure from women, from trade unions and politicians, well, they've ensured that our maternity rights are far better than those the EU's legislated for. Here, pregnant women are entitled to up to 1 whole year's maternity leave, 39 weeks of which must be paid, and at a considerably higher rate than sick pay. So, you see, we're far more capable of championing our rights without help from overpaid bureaucrats. Lobbying the MPs we vote into power, the same MPs who know we can also vote them out, is a far more powerful and efficient tool to advance workplace rights than abandoning legislation to Brussels. In Brussels, we just have to hope that EU commissioners, some of whom are the failed former leaders of former communist states and very dismissive of women will be feeling charitable on the day they're asked to vote in favour of extending equality legislation. So this is why I think voting to leave the European Union is the safest choice for women. Let's look too at that EU favourite buzzword, harmonisation, the idea of bringing everything into line across all member nations. If we vote to remain and thereby give the EU an even stronger mandate to move towards the full integration of all member states with harmonised legislation, women may well suffer as our rights could be forcibly reduced. You see, the EU talks a lot about equality, but it doesn't walk its talk. Last year, following a sequence of freedom of information requests, the Better Off Out campaign found women working within the European Council were paid, on average, £12,792 a year less than men. They also found sexism was rampant within the European Central Bank. There, not only did men outnumber women 52 to 42% across all jobs, female managers earned a monthly average of £7,736 less than male colleagues holding the same positions. Better Off Out also found that the higher the pay, the greater the ratio of men to women. In other words, the top jobs were far likely to go to men. How did the European Central Bank attempt to excuse this outrage? By saying it was due to a, and I quote, larger proportion of male staff members in managerial positions at the start of the institution, some 15 years ago, and the subsequent impact of career progression. So in other words, they've made no effort in the last 15 years to rectify the gender imbalance among their employees or even balance pay between the sexes. And this is right at the heart of the EU institutions. So it might like to portray itself as a guarantor of the rights of women, minorities and other discriminated against groups, but it's just empty rhetoric designed to cover up the true misogynistic and backwards outlook of many in Brussels who are dinosaurs, I'd say, in terms of women's rights. The statistics prove the EU is serious about gender equality or gender pay, whether it's enshrined in the Lisbon Treaty or not, and we should take no lectures on equality from those prepared to back an organisation that I think is so riddled with ridiculous and duplicitous double standards. EU expansion is also a threat to women's rights here in Britain, and another good reason to leave. In some EU countries, women's rights have been sliding backwards, and of the countries that hope to join, such as Turkey, Serbia and Albania, while they're unlikely to be campaigning to improve the lot of women when they do get in, they're far more likely to want our rights watered down. The President of Turkey has slammed abortion, called birth control treason, and dismissed the idea of gender equality. 55% of the Serbian population doesn't believe men and women are equal, and having been there myself and seen how appallingly women are treated, that comes as no surprise. In Albania, law enforcement authorities reject the idea that spousal rape is a crime, and in Lithuania, already an EU member, it still isn't. There's a specific legal exemption for marital rape. In Bulgaria, rape cases are only prosecuted if the rape victim has fought back against her attacker, meaning those victims who are unable or unwilling to fight back don't have the protection of the law. And if the EU continues to expand as planned, within 15 years, a large percentage of the EU population will consist of people originating from countries where women don't have anything like approaching equality. Opposition to women's rights is increasingly likely to become the norm among EU institutions as they get a greater say in Parliament, in the Council and in the Commission. But it'll never happen here, you might say. Women will always be free and equal in Britain. Really? One train operator in Germany has just introduced women-only train carriages in the wake of the sex attacks in Cologne and elsewhere. Now, you can try to put as much positive spin on that as you like, but you can't ignore the fact this is gender apartheid. The underlying and unavoidable message is that it's better to segregate women and men, that all men must be seen as potential abusers, and that this is a more pragmatic solution to the one that I think we should be demanding, that the minority who seek to abuse women on public transport should be caught and prosecuted. Germany is, of course, a wealthy country. What about women in the poorer EU countries facing poverty and desperate hardship? The EU fails many of them too, and especially women from Romania, Bulgaria and Slovakia, where one consequence of the open border Schengen area has been an explosion in people trafficking, most notably of women sold into prostitution. Young and sometimes underage girls, such as 12-year-old Anna from Bulgaria, who was sold by her parents and forced to work as a prostitute in the Netherlands, are easy prey for traffickers who can take advantage of Schengen. With no border control and no passport checks, there's no one to apprehend kidnappers or ask questions of frightened young girls travelling across several countries. The EU makes it easy for this particular evil to triumph. Human trafficking within the EU is now a £4 billion industry, according to Europol. The International Organisation for Migration says it's easier to traffic humans than it is drugs or stolen cars, precisely because most victims hold an EU passport. Forced labour, sex trafficking, even children trafficked for human organs, these vile trades are flourishing because criminals can almost effortlessly evade capture. So while the free movement of people might sound like a wonderful utopian idea in principle, like any other policy, it has unintended consequences, and even when there's no criminal intent, problems can arise. I was recently almost moved to tears when the best-selling novelist Alison Pearson made a speech saying why she, as a woman, wanted to leave the EU, and she highlighted the free movement of people as one of the reasons. She talked about the demographic bump in those areas of Britain which have seen the highest levels of inward migration, and which means the UK birth rate is now at an all-time high. 1/4 of Britain's babies are born to foreign mothers, which of course wouldn't be a problem if we had the hospital infrastructure and the caring staff to deal with this increase, but we don't. Last year, 575 pregnant women turned up to give birth at their chosen maternity unit, only to be told, you can't come in, we're full. Last year, nearly half of all maternity units were forced to close their doors 5 times on average, and up for 3 days due to over-demand. I'm sure mothers here among us can only imagine how traumatic that must be for those affected. I'll quote Alison again. When the Remain campaign mentions the economic benefits of EU migrant workers, I think of another kind of labour, she said. I think of frightened women left on their own because there aren't enough midwives. I think of pregnant women with a rapidly dilating cervix sent 35 miles in search of a safe place to give birth. This in modern Britain. As mothers, we want the best education for our children too, but England's short of more than 250,000 primary school places. And this year, 100,000 children missed out on their first choice of secondary school. The National Audit Office estimates that if EU migration carries on at current levels, we'll need a staggering 900,000 extra school places by 2024. The complacent attitude of the Remainers seems to be that the British people will just have to suck it up, Alison said in her speech. It's outrageous. How would the Prime Minister feel if he couldn't find a primary school place close by for Florence, his little girl? That's never going to happen though, is it? The rich and the privileged don't live in the areas where immigration puts pressure on education and housing, and where maternity units say, sorry, we're full. There are plenty more issues I could point to, and I'm sure we'll discuss some of them, but these are just a few of my ideas to demonstrate how bad the EU's been for women and how it could get much worse. But ultimately it comes down to who you most trust to stand up for your rights. The unelected, unaccountable, and often sexist bureaucratic elite, or us, the people, the women here in this room, all of us, proud, strong, capable people of Britain who will lobby our MPs to do what's right and boot them and the government out if they don't. I believe the most powerful tool we have at our disposal as women is at the ballot box, and I want to protect the ballot box and indeed extend its power, not slowly abolish it. The future for women in Britain is bright if we leave the European Union, less so if we remain. And if you're a woman, please don't make the mistake of thinking nothing will change with a Remain vote. It's not a vote for the status quo, it's potentially a vote for something much worse. The vote to leave, on the other hand, is a vote that keeps women in the driving seat and the powerful under our democratic control. A vote to leave is the safe option.